Okay. Most those of you who don't know me, I'm a medical doctor, board certified internist. I have been a assistant clinical professor and an associate clinical professor at medical schools. Well, probably 5 of them. Up until recently, I was licensed in 5 states. I think, well, it's hard to say how many states I'm licensed in now, but at least 3: Hawaii, California, Oregon, Minnesota, and that, pretty much extends all over the United States. I'm pretty much allowed to practice medicine, and I've been at it. I'll tell you. Not only have I been at the change in diets that have occurred over the last half century, but I've also seen the development of modern medicine. It's been in my lifetime that they started doing heart surgeries, bypass surgeries, angioplasties. It's been in my lifetime that we've been doing conservative breast cancer surgery and then radical surgery. It's been my lifetime that we treated high blood pressure with pills. And we've had all these new diabetic medications that have been advertised to us. I've lived it, ladies and gentlemen. So, not only being a medical doctor that's personally cared for over 12,000 people, I lived at a time when medicine and nutrition ideas were developed that you're living with today. And it gives me the right to have you question what you're being told to have done to yourself. I mean, after all, you're the ultimate in receiving benefits or harms, aren't you? You're the one that gets hurt, not your doctor, not often. So you want to be an informed consumer, and you can be an informed consumer. In this day and age, half the articles available, scientific articles that I refer to, are open access. That means you can read the entire article yourself. And then about half of the articles, they are copyrighted, and publishers try and make some money off of them, even though many of these articles were paid for by your tax dollars and your consumer dollars. And there is a website. It's a changing website. It appears here on the screen. Let me get this up here a little bit better for you. It appears here on the screen, and I want you to write this down. You could get pretty much any article that I'm able to get. I have the university connection, so I get some scientific articles. But, if I say something that seems a little bit off base, or I can hardly believe that, or Dr. McDougall must be exaggerating, I'll go look at the scientific paper. Well, here it is, folks. You get the address. It's SCI-HUB. I think Science Hub is what it stands for. And then a different country, and they've had to change the country that I've referred to since I've been going to this website. It changed from Siberia to Russia. It's now being held in Russia. So I guess you could say it's probably not as legal as it could be, but hey, at least these folks, they believe you should have access to the knowledge, and hiding the truth from you just keeps you being a victim. You're not the kind of consumer you ought to be. Anyway, let's talk about colon cancer. And cancer is something I've been interested in ever since I started. I started back in 1968. I went to medical school. And I got most of my training in the 70s and early 80s. I started being a doctor. And in that time, I've seen people go from low carb to high carb, and now they're back to keto diets. And as I say, I've been through pretty much all of it. And cancer's been one of my favorite subjects, and particularly breast cancer, but I'm going to talk to you about colon cancer in this particular presentation. Got interested even when I was in medical school in cancer because, in part, oncologists are some of the most powerful doctors and most respected and most feared because the emperor has no clothes. That's why I discovered that later. But even in my residency, I had this special interest in why do people get cancer? And does it have anything to do with diet? And so I went to the first medical conference ever held on cancer. In part, it was in Seattle, Washington in the late 1970s. In part, I went to meet this man here, Ernst Wynder. He was at that time in the late 70s, early 80s, in fact, all through the 70s and 80s. He was the most powerful person in the world in terms of science and disease, in particular cancer. He founded the American Health Foundation in 1969, which was a group of about 400 scientists, top scientists in the world, to study the relationship between disease and, in particular, diet. He founded the journal Preventive Medicine, which is still a very important journal today. He himself had published over 800 papers. And I wanted to meet Dr. Ernst Wynder, who was so well respected and so much interested in diet and cancer. In fact, this is one of the first papers that you see on the right that I found, which showed his observation. He wrote about his observation that women in Japan who get breast cancer live longer than women in the United States who get breast cancer. And the reason he proposed is because of what they eat. They eat a starch-based diet. And he published this in 1963. Anyway, I pursued this man, and it was held in Seattle in 1978, a weekend. And I got in touch with Dr. Wynder, and I said, Ernst Wynder, I said, can we get together? Can we have like breakfast together? And he said, sure. You know, we went to a breakfast table that was surrounded with a few other interested medical doctors and health professionals. And first thing that happened is the waitress came over and asked what we wanted to eat. And Ernst says, I'll have whatever that young man over there is having. And of course, he got oatmeal and blueberries. And then we started talking, and Dr. Wynder started telling me he was not shy about talking about himself. And he started talking about how he discovered the causal association of smoking cigarettes to lung cancer. And here's this paper he published in 1950. He discovered this. He said, you know, I made these observations, and, you know, none of these are based on a randomized controlled trial. It's all based on observations of what happens to smokers. And he said, I discovered this, that, you know, tobacco has carcinogens in it that cause lung cancer. And he said, I went to my associates at Sloan Kettering Institute and the American Cancer Society and various other organizations. And I said, you know, smoking causes lung cancer. And he said to me at breakfast, he said, you know what their response was, John? They said, nah, it can't be. And I told him, he says, you just take it, you roll up this tube of tobacco and you stick it in your mouth and you suck on it and you get lung cancer. And they couldn't believe it. But that's who I was talking to, a person that famous who changed the world. And as breakfast continued, I asked him lots of questions. And then he got to the end of breakfast. He said to me, John, he says, you know, I'm the one who discovered that what you eat causes colon cancer. Oh, will you tell me about that? He says, yeah, I went to my colleagues, Sloan Kettering Institute and other famous cancer doctors around the world. And I said, what you eat causes colon cancer. And their response was, nah, you got to be kidding. He says, oh, he says, you eat this stuff and it makes the colon sick, it carcinogens, all kinds of things, and you get colon cancer. They couldn't believe it. But today, I don't think there are many reputable people who don't understand that what you eat is the primary cause of colon cancer, whether your intestines are sick or healthy. I mean, around the world, what you find is probably the most important association with colon cancer, and that's the consumption of red meats. Of course, we think of beef, but there are several red meats out there. And what you find is a direct correlation between death from colon cancer worldwide. And the consumption of red meat, that should be a good clue. But I don't want you to forget the fact that when people eat diets high in meat and dairy, but by obligation, the diet has to be low in starches, vegetables, and fruits. I mean, it's either one or the other. You're going to get your calories from fats and proteins and animals and oils, or you're going to get it from potatoes, rice, corn, etc., or somewhere in between. But there's a polarization of diets around the world where places like in Asia and rural Africa, where they have very little colon cancer, they eat a starch-based diet. They eat, I hate to be so specific, but they eat the kind of diet that I've been recommending to you for 50 years based on corn and rice and potatoes, etc. Very, very few animal products. Well, the science has developed over the last, well, this started back in back in the 1960s, this kind of study worldwide. And science has developed, and many issues have been taken to the laboratory. And a lot of the evidence originally came from Africa, rural Africa, where you've heard me talk about Dr. Dennis Burkitt. He was the head of Ministries of Health there, and he found no colon cancer in Uganda when he practiced there in the 60s and 70s. He took care of like 10 million people, oversaw 1,000 hospitals for 17 years and saw no colon cancer because they ate a starch-based diet, very few animal products. Yeah, so a lot of our evidence came from there, and then we took it to the laboratory and we started studying things. Well, what is the point where we can actually measure genetic changes that are produced in the cells as a consequence of eating red meats? Beef, for example. So that's how far the sophistication of science has gone. About 2.5% of people following the Western diet will have to face colon cancer. About half of them die of it. Half survive and they die of something else, heart disease, et cetera. Your lifetime risk of getting colon cancer if you eat the Western diet. Remember, rural Africa, no colon cancer, in Asia up until they started switching their diet. No colon cancer. All right. So 1 in 30 chance in the general population of getting colon cancer. The way that you prevent colon cancer, and of course, I think a very important part in preventing colon cancer and treating colon cancer is a healthy diet. Even if you've developed polyps, I'm going to talk to you about how you can change the course of precancerous lesions, which is really the basis of prevention. I'm going to talk to you about other methods of prevention too, like sigmoidoscopies and colonoscopies, but you're going to understand the distinction as we go through it, because I'm going to go through it in a very orderly manner for you and take some quite complex issues and, explain them well. Hopefully I explain them so that you can easily understand them. The truth is simple and easy to understand, and I'm going to try and make it that way for you over the next few minutes. So diet is the foundation of the cause and the prevention and also the treatment of colon cancer. This is out of Johns Hopkins University. It talks about the natural history of the development of colon cancer. And what I want to do is I want to start up on the left-hand side of this chart. You see hyperproliferation. What happens is what you eat, and it's been focused on red meat and processed meat, but it's the whole darn diet. What you eat either provides a comfortable environment for the cells in your colon, or it is very irritating and damaging. The response to irritation of the colon, like other mucous membranes, is proliferation. The cells proliferate in greater numbers, and they form lumps. You see it labeled hyperproliferation. These are lumps that try and block the irritation. And through continued stimulation and through continued irritation and damage, the lumps grow bigger. And finally, they got big enough that we call them polyps. They get about a little less than 1/2 inch in size. And, we might call them polyps, or maybe 1/4 inch in size. We call them polyps. And that takes a while. I want to point out to you that to go from a normal colon to a mature polyp where it's ready to turn into colon cancer, and it's got to get about a little over 1 inch in size before there's even a significant risk of developing colon cancer. It's been growing for 15 years in the precancerous phase. And then it becomes cancerous. To become cancerous, it invades through the colon wall into the bloodstream and spreads to other parts of the body, like the brain, liver, lungs, bones, and that's metastases, and metastases kills. To go from the point where this polyp becomes cancerous to death from cancer takes another 15 years. So we're talking about 30 years of development. That's the spectrum. So it's going to be important for you to remember that fact when we go on and talk about these instruments for early detection, for you to understand that to go from normal colon to a barely cancerous polyp takes 15 years and another 15 years to kill you. Yeah. All right. Let's take a look at what happens in that polyp becomes cancerous. All right. Here you have one cell in that polyp that goes from a normal cell to a cancerous cell. And one of the qualities of a cancerous cell is that it divides at its own free will. In other words, the rest of the cells in your body, they live under rules. Like you can't go dividing unless, for example, you're growing as a child. Then you can divide. Or if you cut yourself, then you can divide and repair the wound. But otherwise, you're not allowed to divide. Well, these cells, they get irritated by the food that we eat in the colon. The cells in the colon get damaged to the point where they stop obeying the rules and they start dividing at their own free will, and they divide at an orderly rate that differs between different people and different diets. But the average doubling time is every 100 days. That's 3.5 months. So that one cell that's cancerous, and a polyp contains probably 500 million cells. But one cell becomes cancerous, then it doubles into 2 in 3.5 months. 100 days later, it doubles into 4, and then 8, and then 16, and then 32. You've had cancer for a year. You've got like 10, 20 cells in this tumorous mass of 500 million cells. The divisions continue, and at 2 years, you may have, by this kind of doubling every 100 days, you may have somewhere around 200 cells, 100 cells, 200 cells. But you've had cancer for 2 years. And at these points, what happens is these cells break through into the bloodstream, into the venous system. They go into the lymphatic system too, but the venous system is what's important, and that carries them to other parts of the body where they sometimes seed and become metastases. And the divisions continue. They continue. And finally, after 6 years of development, you've got a tumor in the polyp. And in other parts of the body, you've got similar sized tumors. After 6 years that are the size of a tip of a pencil, a period on a paper, 1 millimeter in size. And finally, after 10 or 15 years, you've got a tumor mass that is a cancer that's really detectable. It's been growing for 10 or 15 years. It contains 1 billion cells. So this is a very slow growing process. And so you've really got to catch it early if you're going to make a difference. And the problem is you can't really catch it early because of the fact that it spreads when it's like, I don't know, certainly fewer than a millimeter, or the size of a period on a paper. It's spread nearly 90% of the time. Try and remember this natural history as we go through it, because it'll make a lot more sense to you why early detection doesn't work. Early detection is really a late detection. Half to 3/4 of the disease has already occurred without anybody knowing. All right. So the idea being, the common sense being, the logic being that if you can find a cancer early enough, you can remove it before it has a chance to spread to the rest of the body. But as I just showed you, it takes as long as 10 years before the tumors are big enough to detect. So how in the world are you going to find it early enough? Well, anyway, that's the hope. That's why you're told to screen, to do all these testings to find cancer early. And so the American Cancer Society, U.S. Preventative Service Force Task Force on Prevention of Disease, has made recommendations, and they say that you should, as a mindful consumer, patient, citizen, you should be tested on a regular basis for early detection of colon cancer. That's the recommendation. And that recommendation was made in 2016, still stands today. Nothing's changed. Now, what the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force tells you to do is to check for early signs of cancer, and you could use any of 7 different techniques. You could do colonoscopy, which is the most extensive. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about. You could do a flexible sigmoid, which I'll explain to you what that is. That's a shorter tube. You can do a virtual colonoscopy, which is an X-ray. where they go in and they can find tumors that are about a centimeter in size, about the size of a eraser of a pencil, about the earliest size you can detect. Or you can do tests of stool for blood. You could do immunologic tests for blood. You could do tests for genetic material, which are called Cologuard. You got a whole bunch of things. But what I want you to notice is what they say across the top in red letters. These options are presented to you in no preferred order or rank. In other words, one is not better than the other. They tell you right up front. You go, how can that be? Well, I'll give you some basic information that hopefully we can refer back to, but I'll show you how it can be. Colonoscopy. The colonoscopy is a procedure you're told to start having when you're, well, sometimes 40, sometimes 50. And you need to go into either a medical center or a hospital. And you get some kind of sedation, commonly, particularly in the United States, as opposed to Europe. And, this may even amount to an anesthesia. And then a tube, which is 6 to 8 foot long, is passed through the anus, up through the, let's go through these parts of the ball here. Well, I'll go through it again with you. Here's the anus, up through the rectum. This is called the sigmoid right here. You see it kind of like an S, isn't it? This is what we call the descending colon. This is the transverse colon. And this is the ascending colon. Well, the colonoscopy, the sigmoidoscopy goes up to about here. And we'll talk about that a little more later. But colonoscopy, they go through this whole 8 foot long colon. And it takes about sometimes as much as 3 days of preparation of you taking laxatives, eating a no fiber diet, as much as 3 days to get yourself cleaned out. Usually it's done if less time than that. And it takes at least 30 minutes to do the procedure. It's a big deal. Well, the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, they consider a colonoscopy the gold standard. And so do gastroenterologists. They'll tell you that it's the only thing that makes sense is to do a colonoscopy. In fact, there is a statement that I can show you that says that doing a sigmoid exam, which we're going to talk about, it's only a 2 foot exam, versus a colonoscopy, which is like a 6 foot exam, is similar to examining only one breast for breast cancer. That's what they say. Of course, you know how I feel about mammographies and examining the breasts, et cetera. If you do, you know that it makes little difference and brings up a lot of harms. Anyway, they go on, the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force said, we still think that the gold standard is a colonoscopy, but we understand that there are risks involved, like bleeding and perforation. And plus, you find a lot of polyps that would have never troubled the patient. This is called overdiagnosis. You'd have died of something else first, but because they found it, you have to live the rest of your life as a cancer victim. You can't get life insurance. You can't get health insurance. You can't get a job. This is overdiagnosis. This is finding tumors that would have never killed you. And you get overtreatment, which is really common. Could never fault a doctor from aggressively treating a patient. Well, at least that's what I found in my medical career. It's a $10 billion a year business, colonoscopy is. And this business is taken to the public. Here's some highway signs that encourage you. In fact, they shame you into not getting your colonoscopy done. I like the one in the bottom right-hand corner. There's a better way. Get a colonoscopy. One way, do not enter. I think that was a coincidence. Anyway, you'd think you were stupid, you were foolish to not get a colonoscopy, wouldn't you? Well, let's go on here a little bit. I wrote the first article on colonoscopy, titled Colonoscopy, a Gold Standard to Refuse, the title of this lecture. I wrote this in August of 2010, so it's been more than 12 years. And I told you in that article, that colonoscopy doesn't work. And I told you at that time you should be getting a sigmoidoscopy, which I still recommend, and I'll tell you why. And then I went on and talked to you in a further article in July of 2016. I encourage you to read both of these evaluations. It discusses the current recommendations on whether you should or should not get a colonoscopy. The risk of colonoscopy. This is not a benign procedure, all right? There are 3.4 serious events for every 1,000 people within 30 days. You know, there are estimates I could show you where polyps are removed that 7% of people suffer serious complications, like, for example, bleeding. The most serious complication is perforation. This can occur in as many as 1 in 1,000 people. And 1 in 2,000 might be expected to die. Now, you got to consider we're making this recommendation to otherwise healthy people. I can think of 2 women in my practice that I heard about. I only knew them superficially, but the story is just as important. 2 women, mothers, children, husband, job, you know, fully having a great time, did their duty in their early 40s and went and had a colonoscopy. Both of them suffered perforation, but one of them died in the intensive care unit. The colonoscopy can kill. And I want you to consider what you're agreeing to when you agree to have a colonoscopy. You're agreeing to risk your life today for the theoretical benefit that finding a polyp early or colon cancer early is going to cause you to live longer 10, 20, 30 years from now. That's the bet you're taking. If you take in, you compare the life saved, the most optimistic findings of lives saved. One life is saved for every 1,250 people. But that's about the same rate as killing people with perforation. It can be as high as 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 2,000, somewhere between 1 in 1,000 and 1 in 2,000. So it's almost an even. Okay, let's go on. So anyway, you need to consider this as a procedure done with harms. Why is it done? Why is it accepted the common procedure? When the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force tells you that these are not ranked in any preferred order, your survival benefits are going to be the same. Well, this is the reason. It's cash is king. To check your stool, well, if you do it with blood tests, somewhere between, you know, checking it for a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, it's somewhere between $30 and $40 to find out that you don't have colon cancer or a high risk of colon cancer. You can have a Cologuard procedure, which is heavily advertised on TV these days. And these are, you know, highly sensitive procedures for detecting polyps and early colon cancer. But that costs, the last I looked, was about $600 to get that test done. Or you can have a sigmoid exam, which is somewhere between $100 and $200. Actually, I looked up in our town, they were like about $100 to $200 done. If you could find a place that would do that. No sedation, virtually no risk when it's done through a flexible sigmoid instrument. Whereas if you get a colonoscopy done, it's $3,000. The latest study I want to talk to you about, this is what the one you want to look up, okay? I gave you the reference. It's easy to find. This is the study that I want you to look up because it's such an important study and it hit all the news headlines. And this is the reason I'm bringing this discussion up to you, is because you may have read the headlines. You may have gotten a false spin on the findings. Sometimes that happened, not always. And you may be misled into thinking somehow this study showed benefits that should cause you to get a colonoscopy done. Well, not everybody was fooled. Here's some of the newspaper headlines or news headlines from Nature, for example, October of 2022. They showed huge trial yields disappointing results on colonoscopy. Here's a news report. Colonoscopy is not maybe as effective as thought, study suggests. Doctors disagree. You see, the spin doctors get in there and they try and find some way to make you to believe that the findings are otherwise than they are, but they can't. Editorial in the Lancet, controversy over colonoscopy for colon cancer screening. Doctors are talking about this, but the message they're getting to the patient is a little different. Here's the study done. Well, okay. One thing I want to make clear for you is that colonoscopy and sigmoidoscopy and these tests for stool for blood and genetic tests, et cetera, they do find more polyps and more cancers. They do. There's no question about it. But that's not really important. Nor is it important how early they find it. What's important is that the end result is of benefit to you. And that means only one thing. And that means if you take and do a study called a randomized controlled trial, and you take one group of people and you don't do the test on them, and you compare it to another group of people where you do the test on them, in the group that you intervened, in other words, did the colonoscopy or the sigmoidoscopy or the stool for blood, the group that you did the screening test on, you ought to have more people alive at the end of the study than in the control group. That's the only thing that counts, because of what I told you. You know, I told you the testing and treating, it's not just the colonoscopy and the perforations and the bleeding, et cetera. It's the fact that then you have to go on to further tests that can be dangerous. You go on to treatments like surgery, radiation, chemotherapy. So if you're going to do a screening test that is of true value to the public, you must show that those who undergo the intervention, that group lives longer. A reduced overall mortality. Okay? That's what you need to see. All right. So they did this study, and yes, they found because they looked. In the intervention group, because they looked, they found more polyps, more early cancers, no question about it. And they likely went to treatment earlier. No question about it. But the question is did they live longer? Did they live longer? They had less risk of dying of colon cancer, which you see colon cancer-related deaths at 10 years. The invited group, 0.28% of them had colon cancer-related deaths, but 0.31% of them in the usual care had colon cancer-related deaths. In other words, you had fewer people dying of colon cancer than those who had the colonoscopy. All right? So in other words, you may have saved a life, but you ended up killing a person through the testing, the treatments, et cetera. So what we really need to do is we need to look at the bottom left-hand corner, and we need to look at die from any causes, overall mortality. And you see they're virtually the same. 11.03% in the invited group and 11.04% in the control group. They're the same. Here you can see the graph here. They're the same. This is the first randomized control trial ever done on colonoscopy. And this is where the colonoscopy doctors had their hope that the business would thrive. Don't let them fool you. Yeah. You may be saving your life from colon cancer, but you may be ending your life a lot sooner from death from anesthesia or colon perforation, et cetera. Okay, look it up. Look up the paper. First randomized trial ever done on colonoscopy. All right, here's a review that was done in 2016 that looked at the previous studies, and they said the same thing. They said, look, there's no randomized control trial, other high-quality evidence showing that colonoscopy reduces even colorectal cancer mortality, even people dying of just colon cancer. Disease-specific mortality, we call it. We saved you from dying from colon cancer, but you died of a perforation or anesthesia death or surgery death. That's overall mortality. Died from disease-specific mortalities. You had. They say there's not even a good quality study that say you're going to have a reduced risk of dying of colon cancer. You see, doctors know that. What I'm trying to share with you is the professionals know this. But there's just so much money to be made. Well, it's not that way around the world. It's in the United States. And I'm sure several other countries. I haven't looked into it, but In Canada, the Canadian Task Force on Preventative Healthcare, in 2016, they told Canadian citizens to stop getting a colonoscopy as a screening test. You have to differentiate screening, which I didn't do previously, and I could have and should have. Screening is when you go looking for cancers in healthy people. It's also known as disease mongering. You turn healthy people into patients. That's what screening is all about. You're looking at healthy people. If you have a problem with your bowels, or say you flunk one of those fecal tests for blood, you'd be in a different category. You'd be into a category where we're talking about now a diagnostic colonoscopy. You're not looking for disease in healthy people. You've got somebody who's got a problem. You're going in to do the colonoscopy to look further into that problem, diagnostic. So the Canadian government, but that's the way basically all European countries have practiced, is they tell their citizens to not get a colonoscopy. Well, this study, which was done in Norway and Poland that I just showed you, that was done on a large population of people who have never been exposed to colonoscopy. So you should have found a lot of tumors and saved a lot of lives. You should have, yeah. Let me take you back a few years, and maybe I can put this into some relevance for you. As a medical student, part of my duty was to do a history and physical on a patient. And sometimes I do, 3 a day. Sometimes I do 12 a day. I remember one patient, he was 80, enjoying life, he was in for a hernia repair. And my job was to do an exam on him. Of course, I was taught to do a thorough exam, which meant a rectal exam. And I did the rectal exam, the finger exam, and I felt a tumor. I felt a cancer. I was so proud of myself. I could hardly wait to get to his doctors and tell his doctors and his surgeons that I found a colon cancer on this 85-year-old gentleman who was enjoying life. Anyway, about 3 months later, I met up with the surgeons who took him, my patient, my 85-year-old patient, who I found the colon cancer on, took him to the operating room. And I said, how's my patient doing? They said, well, he died on the operating room table. That's the first patient I saved from cancer. So the way that you get misled in statistics is this, look, if you die of colon cancer, in other words, a very withering disease, your death certificate will say died as colon cancer. But say you go for a treatment, chemotherapy, a radiation, a surgery, or just further colonoscopies, and they kill you in the process, then your death certificate is signed as that cause. Died from surgical complications. But the reason that he went for surgery is because he had colon cancer. It should have been, anyway, that's how the death certificates get mixed up. And that's how some of the statistics get mixed up. All right. What I should have done with this patient, just to add a little bit of information for you, and this may be stretching you a little bit, but I feel I have to, because some of you will be faced with this. A decision that I was faced with early in my career, and a decision that could have applied to my 85-year-old patient who I saved from colon cancer, who died on the operating room table. You understand the natural history of this disease. By the time it is at the point of killing you, it's been developing, it's been growing for 10, 15, 20, 25 years. If it's spread throughout the rest of the body. The course has already been determined. The cattle are already out of the barn. It's metastases that kill. All right. So some of you know, and the rest of you, I'd like you to know, it's the way I put through myself through medical school, was I was a surgical nurse. What I did all day long, 8, 10, 12 hours a day, on the weekends, overnight, is I handed instruments and held retractors for doctors in the operating room. That's my job. I was in on thousands of operations. And one of the most memorable operations for me was one that involved 2 teams of doctors, 2 teams of surgeons. And it was, of course, a big setup for me as a surgical nurse with all these instruments for these two teams of doctors. One team started at the top, at the belly, and they made the incision through the abdominal wall, through the muscles. And the patient was strapped up in leg braces so that they were exposing their perineum, the rectal area. And the other team, they got busy working from the bottom up. And about a half an hour later, this was the joke. The joke was one team would reach through the hole created and shake hands with the other team through the patient's body. That's called an abdominal perineal resection. That's still done today. Can you imagine the brutality, the risk of the patient dying from that kind of procedure? Well, you know, I had a chance to look at Dr. Madden's work, who is from New York, extremely well-known gastroenterologist, and the way he approached this problem of having a cancer in the rectal area that would require, in most people's minds, these extensive operations, is he would take a wart burner, you know, hyperkit. You can actually tie these. Now, I don't know how strong they are, but the ones that we use were quite strong. That just through electricity, just burn stuff off like warts. And he would take this electrocoagulating instrument, and he would just go over the tumor and destroy those tumor cells. Do you know what the results were? These patients who went through this relatively non-invasive procedure lived on average a year longer than those who went through the abdominal perineal resection. And still today, doctors are arguing about what they ought to do. So if you or any of your relatives are ever faced with any kind of cancer treatment, but in this case, we're talking about colon cancers and rectal cancers, and you want to get as little as possible done that'll take care of the obvious tumor with the least amount of mutilation and threat to your life. Too few of these procedures are done. All right, so these are your options, and you can start out by checking your stool for blood. You can do an immunochemical test for blood. You can do a Cologuard test. You can do a sigmoidoscopy or colonoscopy. You know, the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, they tell you it doesn't make any difference, and I showed you why. Because the overall survival is the same. Yeah, if you find blood in the stool, you have to go and have a colonoscopy. Then it's a diagnostic colonoscopy. I also explained to you how this develops. It goes from colon polyps that are caused by irritation of the colon tissues from the food we ate. And these are the precancerous lesions. And these are the lesions that we want to take out that may reduce the risk of dying of colon cancer. And I tell you why. I'm going to show you, again, I'm going to show you a very positive side to the study before I'm done, to the research that has been done over the past years, and what a good percentage of the gastroenterologists understand. Whether they practice this way or not, they understand what I'm going to be telling you about now. So you've got all these different choices. Which is better? Well, which is better? And the first place to start is in my August of 2010 newsletter, and read about it there. Is to do the sigmoidoscopy is a much preferred procedure, and the reason is because you do it through this flexible tube, cost a couple $100, maybe $100, no anesthesia, virtually no risk of a problem. But still, you say to yourself, well, doc, if there are other tumors I should be catching that I'm going to miss with the colonoscopy, I want the whole shebang. I want the whole procedure. But the findings are this: 2/3 of the cancers are found within the first 2 feet of the colon. So a sigmoid reaches 2/3 of the cancers. The other cancers that are further on have not been shown to provide a survival benefit when they're treated. Why? Well, it's kind of hard to get into that area of the bowel. You see that it's 6 feet away, and it's hard to clean out that area of the bowel. And there's a kind of tumor that occurs in the right colon area that the colonoscopy reaches that it doesn't seem to be well treated. But what we find is the biggest bang for the buck is in, if we're going to save any lives, is in the left side reached by the sigmoid exam. All right, the positive side to this story is this. Is there's been recently been a review of studies done on sigmoid exams. One sigmoid exam between the ages of 55 and 64, there have been 180,000 people studied, divided them into two groups. One got the sigmoid exam, the other group didn't. One time, okay, between the ages of 55 and 64. Now, you would expect those who got the sigmoid exam, you'd be finding more cancers, more polyps, more tumors, right? But what you want to do is you want to see, and maybe even less risk of dying of colon cancer. But since it's such a safe procedure, you shouldn't see the other side. It should be translated into overall mortality benefits. And what they say in this particular research, looking at these 4 major studies on colonoscopy, is that this is the first and only screening modality to achieve this landmark. Okay, mammography, breast self-examination, PSA testing, lung cancer screening. I know there are people that argue about lung cancer screening. Colonoscopies. No improvement in overall mortality until they did this one screening test. Now, they go on and say something really important, and that is the benefits were because of prevention. In other words, the benefits were seen by taking the polyps, which were not cancer, out, the precancerous lesions. Once it became cancer, it was too late. They saw no improvement in survival with the sigmoidoscopy. But if you could get these little polyps out of there, then it would translate into a overall survival benefit. And that's pretty encouraging, isn't it? Well, remember where the polyps come from. The polyps come from irritation. That's where we started this conversation like 45 minutes ago. It comes from the food, what you put in your intestinal tract. That's how you get the polyps. So wouldn't primary prevention be to eat a good diet? You know, they call primary prevention taking out the polyps that are precancerous. Well, that just shows you how far along they are from the common denominator, doesn't it? All right. Well, what about if you change your diet? You know, somewhere around 40% of people eating the Western diet have polyps, at least 40% over the age of 40. So, you know, you pretty much, you don't know it, but you got polyps if you've eaten the Western diet. So what do you do about it? Well, there's good evidence that if you stop what's going into the intestine and stop irritating the intestine, that these polyps will reverse. You see this in particular in a condition called familial polyposis, where they have thousands of polyps in the colon, genetic defect. If you take and you divert the flow of partially digested food away from the colon, you do this by putting a colonoscopy bag on the patient. And you don't allow any of the bad stuff to go into the large intestine, the polyps regress in about half the cases. So regardless of whether you have the sigmoid done or not, you've got to change your diet if you want the long-term benefits. And even reversal of polyps, I believe, occurs. So my recommendations are pretty much the same as what you'd get in Canada or hopefully Europe now, particularly since this large study done in Norway and Poland, other Western European countries showed it was just a complete failure. And you know why now, don't you? My recommendations are similar to what you're given if you happen to live in one of these countries, including Canada, is that you can check your stool by these various tests, the blood test, the immunologic tests, the Cologuard test. You can do that at recommended intervals, which may be once or could be as many as 3 times once a year. And or you can get one sigmoid exam beginning about age 60. That's a good time. Ending about age 75. Why 75? Because if you got a colon cancer at that age, ladies and gentlemen, you're not going to live long enough to die of colon cancer. And below the age of 60, colon cancer is comparatively rare. So this is the ideal time to be looking around for trouble. But remember, you've got to face the consequences of finding out what's going on. And having one sigmoid exam at this particular age may be of value to you. Certainly a healthy diet can do nothing but good.